I started with the Inca culture, but I soon saw that what the Inca were supposed to have made was beyond their capability technically. So I started to look at megalithic things which suggested that a much older culture existed. And along with that, this interesting phenomenon of strange-shaped skulls started to appear, not only in Cusco and the Sacred Valley of Peru, but also places like Tiwanaku. So I told David Childress that I was thinking of writing a book, and he said, well, why don't we write a book together? And I thought, well, David's famous, so that will work. So David came up with the cover and the name, and I said, sure, David, looks excellent, But the thing is that by the time he and I wrote the book, I was already researching into the area of the possibility that some of these skulls weren't deformed, they were born this way. And that is what I'm still working at. This is the most famous skull in the world, and it's located in a little museum in Ica, Peru, which is south of Lima. And this is the one, if you put elongated skull, alien skull, or anything like that into Google, you'll wind up with this skull. This is, people automatically say this is Anunnaki or alien or hybrid or anything like that, but I'm trying to base my research as much as possible on scientific evidence. I'm trying not to speculate because 90% of the internet is speculation. One of the key things was this word, Chongos. It took me about a year to find out what Chongos was, and it's the graveyard of the nobility of the Paracas culture. And it's only in this graveyard that you find skulls shaped like this. This is another example at the Ica Museum. Both of these skulls come from this place called Chongos. And so through about almost 6 years of research, mainly looking at the concept of deformation, what you'll see is that is a normal human skull from the Inca civilization, not a royal Inca person, an Inca farmer. We can date that person at between 1400 and 1500 AD. In the middle is what you'll see as an example of deformation from the same area. And these are the interesting ones. Again, on the internet, what you'll see is an array of different shapes of skulls that people call Anunnaki, alien, hybrid, etc. The intriguing thing is that one, that one, that one, that one, and I think that one all come from this little place in Peru or area called Paracas. And there's a lot of speculation about the Amarna period in Egypt, that they again are alien hybrids or something like that. But what I'm going to try to show you is the fact that there isn't a lot of actual medical evidence that the Amarna family, such as Nefertiti here, were more than slightly different from a normal human. This is thought to be possibly the skull of Nefertiti. And if you go back from here to there, you'll see that that is very much an artistic representation. That is not the same as this. So Egyptologists, or not Egyptologists, but Egypt experts that I know have told me not to speculate too far into the idea that the Amarna families, such as Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, etc., were necessarily much different from normal people. This is an example of a sculpture of the head of Akhenaten, but again, it could be an artistic representation and not necessarily exactly the way he looked. And this is one of his daughters. This is what the National Geographic Society believe Tutankhamun actually looked like. And that is the profile. As you can see, he didn't look normal, but then again, he doesn't have a huge skull. Some people have said also that the original is much larger, and that National Geographic, because in some circles they're not exactly the most reputable of institutions, reduce the size because they're afraid of the idea that these people actually existed. But this is supposed to be a CAT scan. This is Tutankhamun on the bottom, and that is supposedly Akhenaten, but Akhenaten's skeleton has never been found. And also Nefertiti's mummy has never been found. Some people speculate they found, but there's no concrete evidence. Again, in the art, you see the children seem to have elongated skulls. And what David and I tried to do is look globally as to where this phenomenon of deformation occurred. This is a tribal people on the west coast of Africa in Congo, who originally came from Sudan, which is slightly south of Egypt. So there is a possibility that either as a ceremonial thing or maybe genetically, that these people are descended from the Egyptians of the time period of the Amarna family. And here again, a 20th century photo. You can see the child, obviously, his or her skull has been cranially deformed, most likely. And here's another example of the same tribal group. This is in Melanesia, more specifically in Vanuatu. And so the connection I've been able to find is that, again, I find it very important to look both at what archaeologists and anthropologists have to say, but also the oral traditions of the people. And it's where you have an overlap of archaeology and oral tradition where I think you find the truth. The archaeologists and anthropologists say that these people of Vanuatu came down through Asia and island hopped and reached Vanuatu. But luckily, thanks to the internet, I found a story written by or spoken by one of the elders of these people, and he said, I don't care what these Western people have to say, our ancestors came from Egypt through the Red Sea. So there could be a connection with Egypt. And here's another example of a 20th century photograph from Vanuatu. Malta is another place. The skulls there have been written about, but unfortunately, as is the phenomenon, a lot of the large collections, or even small collections of deformed and elongated skulls in the major museums of the world have been taken off display. And I don't know if it's conspiracy theory, but this is the most recent photograph from Malta, probably from the 1960s. And it shows clearly that these people look kind of different. But the vast collection of more than 200 skulls is not accessible. This is an example from Russia. And this is an example of the Hun people, as in Attila the Hun. Not necessarily elongated crania, but the flattening of the forehead. And that's a phenomenon that is found throughout the Americas, especially in North America. This, Klaus would, if Klaus hasn't seen this before, this is from Austria, probably about the 1st century AD. And up into the Renaissance and beyond, royal families of Europe either fashioned their heads to look like this or possibly naturally looked like this. This is an example from the Mayan culture of Mexico, and this is Olmec. And it's in the art that we see depictions, but probably exaggerations. This is Olmec. These are jade figures, they're very famous. And this is from Tiwanaku in Bolivia, where you find major megaliths, including Pumapunku, possibly the most mysterious megalithic site on Earth, where you have incredible technical precision. Again, unfortunately, when we went with Megalithomania in November, and since then, this display of skulls has been permanently put into storage. And when I asked the people who work at the museum why, they said, we're cleaning them. So 3 months later, I went back, and again, they had paper across this big display case, and I said, "Are you still cleaning them?" And they refused to answer the question. So what is it that people are afraid of? This is a photograph of a child from the Tiwanaku area, and what a lot of people automatically say is that is hydrocephaly, or water on the brain. But what hydrocephaly does, and you can look that up on the internet, it creates basically a beach ball effect, because the pressure will be even throughout the head and skull. So it's not going to create a vertical growth, it's going to create in all directions. And this is one of the oddest ones. This was a young child, supposed to be Inca, that was found by police about 4 years ago in the Sacred Valley of Peru because tomb robbers wanted to export that to Europe, because there's an ongoing black market in elongated skulls, especially in Europe and the United States, where the skull can sell for as much as $1,000 or $1,200. Now this is in Cusco. This is a little museum which is near what's called the Coricancha, which is the most sacred of the Inca buildings. And these skulls are clearly altered in shape, and the little cards simply read Inca. But the problem I'm having, or have had so far in Peru, is the fact that none of these skulls have been DNA tested or carbon-14 tested. And again, the unfortunate thing in Peru is that tour guides and a lot of the archaeologists will simply label everything in the Cusco area as being Inca. This is an example of probably a teenager, and again, it's from the Ica Museum, but this skull came from Paracas. So when we talk about deformation, cradle boarding is the most common technique that academics will say is responsible globally for this phenomenon. And of course, you know, the flattening of the forehead would have been the result of this sort of technique. This is another, you know, supposed representation of how this was done, starting most likely about 6 months of age or a little earlier, before the actual calcium forms, because a baby skull is very pliant, so you can manipulate it. And this is another technique, supposedly, and another technique. The one thing David and I have been able to find out is when all of these diverse cultures, whether they're in northern Iraq, amongst the Olmecs, Melanesia, etc., when they're asked, this practice ended at the end, the latest examples at the end of the 20th century, but when they're asked, why do you do this to your children? It's always and solely the nobility that this was done to. And the common theme is, A, it makes them more intelligent, B, we think it's beautiful, and C, this is what the ancestors looked like. So without immediately jumping into alien visitation, but having that as an option, we see up until presently in Peru, this was done by people in the Amazon. But this is where it gets curious, because this is a 19th century drawing by an anatomist called Teshuti, and this, he saw, was a fetus in the Archaeology Museum in Lima. It's not on display, but if you look at that skull and that head, you can see clearly it's not normal, and it's probably not a disease that caused that. Amongst the artistic representations, again, we have the Olmec, who are a very mysterious culture and could very well have been either the makers of what we call the Mayan calendar or the earlier keepers, because there's too much emphasis on the Maya and the Mayan calendar. It could have been the Olmec. And again, amongst the Amarna family of Egypt, we have these representations. But this, excuse me, I'll have a little drink of water. This is an artifact that I picked up when I was at Tiwanaku. This young teenager on a bicycle came up to me, very scared, excuse me, and he showed me this artifact, and I automatically bought it. Because in the center, what you have is Viracocha, who is the creator god. And on either side are female figures, and you can see from the heads that they're kind of different. And this is another one that I got from him, and another one. Either these people are wearing hats, or maybe these are at least 2,000 years old. What I think is that these are representations of some kind of ancestral people. And again, there were many, many examples of these elongated skulls at Tiwanaku Pumapunku, the display having been closed down. Oh, sorry. And even in the little museum in Cusco, what they state is from the fragmented knowledge we have of the Inca, because so much was wiped out by the Spanish, that the Inca themselves had elongated heads. This is the normal representation we see of what the Inca looked like, but what most people don't realize is that at least 90% of the Inca died, the royal family, were murdered during the civil war that preceded the occupation of the Spanish. And so these are paintings that the King of Spain asked his artists to make as to what these Inca royal people looked like. But since most of the Inca were dead, what they had to do is simply walk the streets of Cusco and depict them this way. But this is not necessarily what the Inca looked like whatsoever. A key factor in my research is that everywhere I find megaliths in Peru, I also find these elongated skulls. This is where Tiwanaku is. This is where Cusco is. This is where Ayacucho, where the recent discoveries have been made. And this is Paracas. And if you notice, there's a road system that connects them all. People say that the Inca built the road system, but it's more likely that this road system is thousands of years older than the Inca, and that the fact that we're finding the elongated skulls and megaliths at the same place hints at the idea that the megalith builders were the elongated headed people. This is what academics believe the Paracas people, which are my principal study, looked like. But the last of the Paracas died 2,000 years ago, so this is sheer speculation. However, the headdresses we have recovered, and you can see either it's a hat or it's something used to adorn a cranium, which is not the kind we find in this room today. And there are very curious things about the Paracas people. One is that they were not megalith builders, because on the coast of Peru, you don't find stone. You find sand and clay. So they were pyramid builders. This is the site called Chongos, which is where the graveyard is, where the largest of the elongated skulls have been found. And it's not in isolation. There are many of them. And the royal Paracas people lived underground, which is not a practice that you find elsewhere in Peru. So that's one curious characteristic. This is the door through which you enter, and this is the actual habitation under the sand. And it's because Paracas means raining sand, it's always windy there, that these people were intelligent enough to know that living underground would be a place of climate control. And also in terms of their burials, these are like family mausoleums, only for the royalty, and they were discovered in the 1920s by a famous archaeologist called Julio Teo. And the Paracas, in most academic circles, are thought to be very primitive people, but this is the complexity of their burials. They were wrapped with many layers of incredibly fine textile, the most elaborate and finest textiles that have ever been created in Peru, minimum 2,000 years ago, possibly much, much older than that. And this is Julio Teo. He is the great hero of Peruvian archaeology, but unfortunately, because his research in the 1920s was done in the 1920s, his work was done before carbon-14 existed, and of course, before DNA testing as well existed. And so he made a bunch of presumptions, which to this very day are taken as concrete fact. But gradually, I'm beginning to unravel that, because the Paracas are not, he didn't even bother to study the elongated skull phenomenon for some reason. He believed that they came from this place called Chavin because that was the oldest culture known at the time, dating back 3,000 years. And Chavin is in the highlands of Peru, and that's the great generality, is that all the cultures of the coast originated in the highlands. But the question is, where did they come before the highlands? And thanks to, again, the internet and that sort of access, someone actually mysteriously sent me an email with this, and it states pre-Columbian population dynamics, and it's all scientific stuff, but basically it was a German group that were trying to study the Nazca people who lived very close to Paracas, and they wanted to know what their relationship was with other people in the area. Luckily for me, they included DNA samples from some of the elongated skulls of the Paracas area, and what they found out was that, genetically speaking, there's a very close similarity between the coastal peoples, but basically zero relationship with the highlands. So that means the people of Paracas, to a great extent, didn't come from the highlands in Peru. The Paracas people are not genetically related to anybody else in Peru. So the question is, where did they come from? Well, since Paracas is next to the ocean, as you can see here, and their culture occupied this, actually a huge area here, and a lot of their work has been wrongly given to the Nazca people, who are far more famous. The Paracas have lived in obscurity since the 1920s, and it's only now that by combining the fact that they had elongated skulls with all these other interesting social phenomena, that they're, who they truly were is finally coming to light. This, for example, is the famous so-called astronaut. And people attribute that, as well as all of the Nazca lines, to the Nazca culture, but that's not true. The more we research, the more we're finding out that the animal figures of Nazca are older than the lines, and the functions were completely different. This, for example, is the famous spider. And you can see there's a line going straight through the spider, vertically that way, and some coming this way and that way. It's as if whoever made the lines didn't even know that the spider existed. The lines can be made easily on the ground because it's flat. All you do is take sticks in a row and you create a Nazca line. But the animal figures can only be seen from the air. And here's another example. This, I believe, is the condor, and you see how the Nazca lines cut through it, as if they didn't know that they existed. And the main clue that guided me to this point was the fact that this, which is called the candelabra, is 600 feet tall, and it sits by itself at Paracas. Now, the question has always been, what does it represent? Some people say it represents a cactus cult, or the tree of life. But Senior Juan Navarro, excuse me, who is the expert on the Paracas people, clued me in about a month ago, because I said, the strange thing is that this points south, and there is nothing but ocean as you look south. Incorrectly, people have said that this points to Nazca, but it doesn't do that. And he said, look up. This is the Southern Cross, but it's upside down. It normally looks that way. But what it is, it could very well be, because based on proportions, it could be the mirror image of the Southern Cross on the ground. The Southern Cross is the major navigational marker in the heavens. All you need to travel south is the Southern Cross, because I studied celestial, not astronomy, but when I lived in Hawaii, I had to learn how to use the stars in order to sail. And it's not as complicated as some people would think. And that's why David Childress and myself and other people believe that global civilizations traveled around the world in deep antiquity without having to be necessarily technically sophisticated. If you knew certain stars and you could build a craft of some kind with some kind of sail, you could travel. Other depictions between Paracas and Nazca, they're not too far apart, but there are almost innumerable geoglyphs, such as this one, possibly showing a large head, go from Paracas all the way through Nazca, but that's not commonly known. And in Nazca, we find pyramids. This one is at Cahuachi, and it's only recently been uncovered. It's massive in size, but it's not the only one. There are at least 30 of the same kind of scale. And again, they have been originally attributed to the Nazca culture, but the Nazca only existed from about 100 BC to 500 AD. Before that, the Paracas people occupied all of this territory. And another wrong assumption are these, which are called trophy heads. And they were thought by most academics as being that the Nazca were very warlike people, and so they would chop people's heads off and tie them to their waist and walk around saying, "Am I not a great warrior?" But what it turns out that they are these are the ancestral Paracas. And they were so revered, the elongated skulls of the nobility were so revered that they were kept separate from the bodies and were brought out as oracles. Another feature, if you go to Nazca, is you'll see that some people have red hair. And again, most academics say, well, that's just bleaching from the sun or oxidation, but that's not true. People with black hair, their hair color is not affected by sunlight. This is natural. Some people in this area had naturally not red hair, like as in Scottish or Irish, but it's an auburn that in the sun glints of this red. That suggests, since Native American people only have black hair, that there's some kind of genetic injection from somewhere else. And these are Paracas skulls in our little museum that have this auburn hair with a red glint to it. This is a critical find. This is basically the only elongated skull of a baby that is in a collection, and we fortunately have that. We haven't unwrapped it yet, but you can see that this maybe 2-year-old has an elongated skull. Now Paracas, where the star is, you can see is right on the coast, and the nearest landmass is Easter Island. And there's been a lot of controversy about what these red hats represent. And my wife and I went there in February, and because we have native contacts, the people who have lived there for a long time, we're able to get the inside story. And what this represents is the way the Polynesian used to, and still do, wear their hair. They wear it in a top knot like that. So these are not hats. These are the nobility, long-eared people of Rapa Nui as represented in the Moai giant carvings, which also, I have to tell you, are not simply from the neck up. They are full bodies buried. Some of them are 30 or 40 feet tall. But this ancient bloodline had this kind of red hair. And that's an example from February, this man. It's one clan of people living on Rapa Nui who have this natural color of hair. If you look at a map of the oceans, and Thor Heyerdahl was critical at showing us this through his Kon-Tiki voyage, which started in Peru and headed that way. And Thor Heyerdahl was vilified as being a racist for suggesting that there was an ancient red-haired people who were able to travel through the oceans with, quite simple sailing technology. But these winds and currents show us that it's not difficult to travel from the west coast of Peru here into Polynesia and beyond. You could go all over the place, including, this is critical, is this area here between North and South America. People could easily have traveled from Europe that way or from this way and crossed between one ocean and the other by crossing that little isthmus. Any sailor would know that. The shortest distance is the best. You're not going to travel all the way around South America to get from one ocean to the other. And what we do know of the Paracas is that there is this shell called spondulus here, and that is only found off the coast of Ecuador to the north. So we know definitely that the Paracas were connected to the people of Ecuador, probably by sailing, because the predominant winds come from the south, but they do change seasonally to come from the north. It's a lot easier to sail than it is to walk. And also what we find at Lake Titicaca is the totora reed. That's also found in a lake on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and throughout the coast of Peru. The great thing about totora, which is what Thor Heyerdahl proved, is that you could build a ship of any size by simply binding these bundles together. And also cotton grows naturally on the coast of Peru, so those people could have built ships. Are there examples of them left? No, because totora and cotton are organic, so they break down very quickly. And then what we find in Paracas, actually this shows 4 distinct types or shapes of skulls, but actually now we know there are 5. This shape is where we do have deformation, the flattening of the forehead. But this one is far more complex and larger, as is this, and as is that. Notice the shapes are different, and all 4 of these are found in different graveyards, as if different social classes had different skull shapes. Also in the back room at the Ica Museum, they only have 5 or 6 of these skulls on display, but being a gringo, I have a tendency to go where I'm not supposed to with a camera, including into the back storeroom at the Ica Museum, and take pictures before they chase me out. And they have multiple examples of different shapes of skulls, as you can see here, including that one, that you're not allowed to photograph and no one's allowed to study. Another phenomenon which was very common in Paracas is trepanation. And most people say, well, trepanation was the result of a brain injury, but most commonly the holes are done through the forehead or through the back of the head. And what we think is that this is brain surgery trying to get at the different glands in the brain affecting different mental abilities. And what we're speculating in general is the fact that in the deep ancient past, people naturally looked this way, but through interbreeding with so-called normal people, the natural characteristics began to disappear, and that's when the binding started to happen, because the natural nobility who had elongated heads were disappearing, and it was as if it was a desperate attempt to bring these special people back. This is possibly the example of, or an example of trepanation where the patient lived for a long period of time, because you can see it could have possibly grown back. And here again on the top of the head. And this is an extreme example. But again, these are all Paracas culture people. And the Inca later adopted this. And this is where some kind of drill was used to get into the skull, possibly to try to manipulate different glands in the brain in order to promote different mental functions that were starting to not be present within the noble population. So this is your skull. This is what almost everybody on Earth looks like. What you have is you have this, oops. What you have is this frontal plate, and then you have these two parietal plates. And that's what a normal human being looks like, as shown here. This is the Inca period skull that I was trying to show you, or that I showed you earlier. You see that there is this suture, which is called, that comes across this way, and one that comes across down through the back. What I'm getting at now is looking at physical characteristics of the Paracas skulls, which are different from the majority of other skulls located around the world. This is the one where we know it's been cranial deformed, where the forehead has been compressed. And you see that there's been pressure put upon these sutures. And that's why they're so obvious looking, because it's not a normal thing to apply pressure to someone's skull as they're growing. But this is one of the Paracas ones. And you see there's only one suture line coming across the forehead. There's no line down through the parietal, where the two parietal plates should be. And here's a close-up. If there was only one of these, then you would say it's an anomaly. But we have numerous examples, and any medical person, doctor, nurse, or whoever, who comes into our museum, whenever they say that, they simply say that's impossible. And then I ask, would you care to elaborate? And they say, I'm sorry, we have to go for lunch now. And this is another example of one. This is the back of a normal skull. You can see again where you have these suture lines. And the next thing is this is what we find in all of the Paracas ones, these two little holes. Some people might suggest that that was part of the binding process, that you would put pins in for some reason to alter the shaping. But they're very natural looking, like they're natural looking holes in the skull. And so, this is another example. And so when we look at a normal human skull, what we can see that is what your jaw has. It has these two things called foramen, and that's where nerves and blood vessels come through to feed that part of your skull, because it's quite a distance from the main blood system. And here is an example. Again, our Inca skull comes back, but what we're theorizing is that the skulls which are naturally elongated, that is nature's way of feeding the back of the skull by having a blood supply come out and a nerve supply come out through the back, because again, it's a great distance from the normal blood and nerve supplies. Another phenomenon which occurs is often in the Paracas skulls, molars are missing. And it's not that they had a bad diet. I've had dentists look at this and they say there should be pits or holes where the teeth were, but it seems to be a genetic feature that certain molar teeth are missing. Another recent discovery is the fact that of the collection of 35 skulls we have, we weighed them and they're on average 60% heavier than a normal skull. They're 25% larger in terms of cranial capacity, and 2,000 plus years ago, the average Paracas person was 6 feet tall. That's men and women. Whereas the Inca in the 1500s were 5'2". The farther back you go in time, the shorter people are. So the term giant to me probably represents someone of greater size. It doesn't mean somebody was necessarily 30 feet tall, but someone who's a foot taller than you on average and has a very elongated skull is going to stand out from the crowd. And finally, more or less, this is one of our latest discoveries, because the beautiful huge skull from the Ica Museum is missing. Again, is it conspiracy? Supposedly it was lent to a museum in, I believe, Switzerland. Whether it'll come back or not, I don't know. But luckily, because local people find these, they're actually in reasonably not great abundance. But because Paracas is the center of this ancient elongated skull culture, in through the door about a month or two ago, this skull appeared. And especially when you look here, you can see the complexity of the form. It would be almost impossible to simply bind that skull and create all these curves and all these different features. To me, this is a suggestion of what the ancestral, naturally elongated skulls looked like. And fortunately, on a recent, this is a comparison again with our Inca skull and the latest Paracas skull. It's not only that it's different in form, the jaw is much larger in the Paracas skull, and the cranial volume is at least 25% larger than a normal human, and the eye sockets are much bigger. The nose is slightly different. There are many features that I still have to explore. I'm more or less doing this by myself. And in terms of people, keep asking about DNA testing. Are you doing it? They don't understand how complex and expensive it is. If somebody, if the police want to do a forensic study on someone who died yesterday, all of the genetic material is fresh, so it's very easy and cheap to study that. When you have DNA that's at least 2,000 years old, most of it is broken down. So the process is far more complex. But fortunately, I've been working with a man called Lloyd Pye in the United States, who's the caretaker of the Star Child skull. And I've just sent from England molar teeth, which I smuggled into England from Peru, because it's very complex to do anything from Peru. The reason why molar teeth are great is because the DNA in the pulp is trapped within that calcium matrix. Even if it's 2,000 or 3,000 years old, there's a good chance that what's inside is still going to be usable. And thanks to donations from different people, I've refused to go through governments or large organizations because they will try to take this information. And I don't care about my reputation, but I don't want anyone manipulating this because this belongs to us. So without embarrassing them too much, I'd like to thank Andre and Lily for donating the last amount we needed. I sent an email to Lloyd Pye this morning telling him we have the money to go ahead. So now we will know by carbon-14 testing and by the beginnings of DNA testing who these Paracas people were. And Peru never ceases to amaze me because I'm always, it's a place that you can never thoroughly explore. On my most recent tour that I gave with some engineers, we stumbled onto this tiny little museum outside of Cusco where we found this more or less on display, and based on my observation of all the Paracas skulls, this person's brain was about 1.8 liters. Your brain is about 1.2 liters in volume. So this is an example of an even larger skull than that of the Paracas people. And again, it's where we find megaliths that we find these skulls. I think these, if they're not the megalith builders, these are the descendants who had special abilities to be able to manipulate stone in such a way that we are still barely able to start to comprehend. And finally, this little skull photographs have been sent around the world, and people say this is alien or this is a hybrid. There is no DNA evidence for that, and that's why I will not get into speculation. I am hoping to get a sample from this, but what's intriguing about this skull is that if you look at the very top of the skull, you can see that's where the sutures are closing in. And from the medical people I've talked to, they say that's normal at about 2 years old in a human being, or a normal human being. But when you look at the profile and you look at the teeth, those are the teeth of a teenager. So this is the most recent and most intriguing example we have so far. I'm not saying that alien-human hybrids have never existed, but we need the DNA results to start to tell us. And from the initial work done by Lloyd's geneticist, who's done this for free so far, he said he's found strands of DNA from the elongated skulls of Paracas that are not in the global database of humanity, and in fact are not in any life form on Earth. And that's where I have to end it.
Hello, hello. There must be some questions.
Is this still on? Ooh, yep.
Do you think it would be a good idea to do outbreeding of our species?
What's that?
Would it be a good plan for our species to exit from our solar system and start to outbreed?
No, I think we just have to smarten up. And seriously, we have to do it now, because that's why I've been fascinated by Native people all my life. Is, you know, not to romantically say Native people know how to take care of the earth, but it's just they have ancient traditions supposedly sent down from the Creator or whoever that's told them how to live, not in harmony, but in balance. And we keep talking about the idea that, you know, we have to do this, we have to do that, but the thing is we have to actually do it. Talking is so cheap. And again, the thing I love about Native people is, in general, they think deep into the future and deep into the past. They learn from the past to teach the children how to live in the future, and we're not doing that. We are a people not simply in crisis, and what a lot of people say, I think quite rightly, is we need the earth, but the earth doesn't need us.
Any other questions?
I mean, she loves us, but we're her children, and we're allowed to do what we want, and unfortunately, we're just being quite stupid in a lot of ways.
I just wondered, how many teeth do these have? Because I've heard of certain things where they've only got 24 teeth. Do they generally have less teeth than us, these particular ones?
Well,
Molars.
yeah, amongst the Paracas, they seem to be missing on average 4 molars, in some cases 8. And actually, one thing I really want to say is, again, you know, some people might think that parts of my presentation are a little bit dry, but that's because I'm trying to find, you know, or I insist upon finding evidence for everything that I talk about. You know, when I say that their skulls on average are 60% heavier, it's because I've weighed them. On the internet, people speculate things like skulls have been found, you know, again, ours average 1.2 liters in size, and some people say skulls have been found 2.5 liters. But where's the proof of that? You know, there's too much nonsensical information on the internet, and as I've said, I don't say that human alien hybrids don't exist or have never existed, but where's the proof? That's what that's obviously what I'm trying to get at, but I'm trying to be as careful as I can, because I don't care if I look like an idiot, but I don't want the Paracas to be known for anything other than who they were.
When you go back to Paracas area and probably in the street, you do not find any person with such elongated skull. Do you try to, in part of your research, do you try to understand why like modern human or the people you see there in Paracas do not have such elongated skull. In part of your research, do you try to understand that?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch
When,
that.
when you go back to that area of the Paracas area,
Uh-huh.
and you see people there without with like a normal scale we have now, but do you try to understand, or part of your research, do you try to understand why you no longer see elongated skull?
Well, no, the last of the Paracas died 2,000 years ago. They were either absorbed into the Nazca culture, or they were destroyed by the Nazca culture, or they escaped from the Nazca culture. They may actually have moved on this ancient road system up into the highlands. So I'm working from the theory backwards from conventional academia that says they came from the highlands. I think they were a complex genetic mix of many different people, possibly even the descendants of Atlantis, which I have no proof of, but still. But that what we know from the archaeological record is that the elongated skulls disappeared 2,000 years ago with the rise of the Nazca. And I think the reason why the Nazca, while they existed as a culture, revered these skulls was that they knew that these Paracas people were astonishingly sophisticated in many ways, much more than they were. And what I'm trying to shed light on is the fact, again, that the animal figures and the pyramids and other things found in so-called Nazca territory were not made by them. They were inherited from the Paracas.
I see an Olmec head in the lower right-hand corner there. I've seen a number of them down in Veracruz, and none of them look like they were cranially deformed. They look African.
Uh-huh. Well, the thing is, and David Hatcher Childress wrote a great book about the Olmec, is that you have to understand the fortunate thing about the area around Paracas and other desert areas is that skeletons become naturally preserved. I mean, Paracas is so dry, it's the driest desert on Earth. And so these people didn't necessarily mummify their dead, but in places like Olmec territory, it's rainforest, and the soil is so acidic that skeletal material disappears very rapidly. One or two examples have been found that I've seen of the Olmecs, but the Olmecs were probably a mix of different people, African and Oriental, because they lived at that very tight area. Olmec territory is only about 100 miles wide. And again, anyone who would be an ancient sailor, because on board an ancient ship, you don't simply have sailors, you have carpenters. So it's quite possible that the Olmec area was like a transit point between the Pacific and Atlantic. You would leave your ship, maybe even partially disassemble it, move it across the isthmus and reassemble it in order to travel the other half of the world. Because you wouldn't travel all the way around South America to get from one to the other. The reason why the British did, because the ships were so big. But a lot of ancient ships were very surface ships, like reed ships and that sort of thing. You could take them apart and reassemble them. Something like, one of the ships of Columbus would be impossible, because they were cargo carriers, like deep water ones.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I think we're going to have to...
Okay, thank you once again.